Hey everyone, welcome to Monday Live. Great to see so many people on the app and on YouTube. Gonna have a great time today. And so a lot is going on. So what do you think is coming next? What do you think the next plan is as we look at different things? So we're gonna be talking about several different things. We're gonna be talking about Israel. We're gonna be talking about a few news items. And then I'm gonna ask our guest today, you already know who he is. You logged on because of that. I'm going to be asking him a question about the Nephilim because there's people who believe it and there's people that don't, and sometimes there's a lot of fights in between. So we're going to have a great time today. And please welcome Dr. Andy Woods to our program. This is great having you back. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a little while, but Tom, I appreciate the invitation and good to be with you this afternoon.
This is wonderful. I know you guys, you have dinner there in a little while. You're ahead of us on the time, so I won't keep you too long. But this is really a blessing to always have you join me on anything that you can. Okay, so Andy, there's this article. It was political commentator Kim Iversen and conspiracy theories that came true in 2022. Unfortunately, I can't talk about too many of those things because they relate to things that are too sensitive for mainstream online news through this channel, through YouTube. But you know, we look at many different things that have happened. Used to be called a conspiracy. You guys are just nuts and all of that. But it is true as we watch things develop, and we have the Bible. The Bible tells us there's certain things. We can understand from looking at the Bible there will be an attempt at a global system. We know that there's going to be this Ezekiel chapter 38 battle that's going to happen. We know that there's going to be a rise of what the Bible calls beast, also known as Antichrist. There's going to be a false religious system. So when we see things develop, we're able, because of the Bible, to project and say, hey, wait a minute. I see this coming from the World Economic Forum or from the UN or from the Biden administration or coming out of China. And we can go, hey, this looks strangely familiar with what Jesus said or with what Paul said or John or Ezekiel or Isaiah. And it really is remarkable how the Bible has already told us ahead of time what to look for.
Yeah, in fact, that's what, Jesus said in the upper room. In chapter John 13, verse 19, and one chapter later in chapter 14, verse 29, he says, I'm going to tell you in advance what's going to happen so that when it does happen, you will know that I am he. So this is a definitive measure that the Bible itself lays down as a test for its own authority, its capacity to predict the future. I don't know of any other religious book that does this. And so if the Bible does lay out a scenario for the end times, which it does, we're totally justified in looking at world events and seeing if there's points of similarity.
Oh, yeah. Indeed. Here's something that just kind of grinds on me, is we have the Bible. We don't need extra biblical things, the Nostradamuses and all these different things, the different visions that people have. If we stick with the Bible, we're going to be on solid ground. But there's so much stuff that goes around out there involving all these different things. A person sees they have a new understanding of an old Greek word that nobody's ever had before, and they'll develop entire scenarios of things that are unfolding and people buy into it. And there's so much deception that's taking place even in the Bible prophecy world that people need to be aware of too. So when Jesus says, one of the things he says, where he's talking about, see, I've told you these things beforehand, one of them is, be careful that you're not deceived. So we can see the deception coming from the government. We can even see deception coming from church is happening a lot right now, especially you start throwing in the transgenderism and the wokeism. But within the prophecy circles, there's a deception that's happening too, and there's charlatans that come in and mislead all kinds of people. Are you seeing that, or am I just kind of reading too much into some of the crazy stuff I see.
No, I think it was Charles Ryrie, and I think he articulated it the best. He says, when you get into prophecy, you gotta stay out of two extremes. One extreme is people that won't take it literally, and they allegorize it, and they just say it's symbolic and it doesn't have any, geopolitical meaning. And then the other extreme, so there's people that see too little, is what Ryrie said. But then he said there's people that see too much. And that's where they get into newspaper exegesis, where they take current events and read it back into the Bible. So those are the two extremes to stay away from, he said. And I think it was Charlie Dyer, who was one of my professors at Dallas Seminary, that said, look, it's okay to look at current events. Just start with the Bible. Don't start with current events. Start with the Bible, do your biblical interpretation, and then take a look at current events to see if there's any correspondence. So, I think that's pretty good advice, and that's what I've tried to do in my ministry. I've tried to stay out of both of those extremes.
Amen. That's a great way of putting it. Is you run current events through the Bible. You don't run the Bible through the current events.
That's right. That's right.
So I want to ask you about some things because there's just different thoughts out there, and I don't think they're worth division over, although some people would go that way. But your thoughts on the Nephilim? I got to get to Israel, Ben-Gvir, walking on the Temple Mount, things are developing over there that are really seem to be escalating tension, plus Abraham Accords. But just your thoughts on Nephilim.
Well, I did a presentation at your conference this last summer on the days of Noah, and you might remember from that particular presentation that I am a Genesis 6, angelic interpretation person. So B'nai Elohim there in Genesis 6 is only used 3 other times in the Bible, in the book of Job, which was the only earlier biblical book than Genesis. And clearly that expression, sons of God, does refer to angels. And so I believe angels in Genesis 6 were cohabitating with human women to create kind of a hybrid race. That's who I think the Nephilim were. The Nephilim literally means fallen ones. It comes from that Hebrew root nephal, which means to fall. And I think the devil was trying to create at that early point in history a race of people that weren't fully God or fully human. They were kind of a hybrid creature, so that Jesus, who's promised in Genesis 3, verse 15, who must be fully man, he must be of the seed of the woman, could never be born. And I think that's why God sent the flood, to stop that genetic experiment. My difference of opinion with a lot of guys today is people are saying, well, that same experiment is going to come back in the last days. That's how they interpret, as Jesus saying, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. But I think that experiment was a one-time genetic experiment that was shut down. It will never be repeated. There really would be no reason for Satan to bring that back, by my way of understanding, because that was designed to prevent the birth of Jesus. Well, Jesus has been born. So Satan is moving on to other things, probably things we're going to talk about in this broadcast, like the destruction of Israel. That's really the preemptive thing he's doing today to prevent the coming of the kingdom. So to make a long story short, that's sort of my take on the Nephilim there in Genesis 6.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. I know a lot of people do believe, and they're out there teaching it, that, listen, this whole Nephilim experiment is coming back in the last days. That's partly what we are experiencing, is what they're saying. Okay, let me ask you, let's switch over to Israel for a few minutes, because things are really escalating there. And you mentioned, and I wholeheartedly agree, that Satan's target is really Israel. Before we get into the Abraham Accords or Ben-Gvir and things that are escalating over there, what's going on with Saudi Arabia, what are your thoughts on why Satan wants to eliminate the nation of Israel or the Jewish people?
Well, you'll see Satan's hatred for the nation of Israel laid out there very clearly in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 6 through 17, where in the second half of the tribulation period, after he's been permanently expelled from heaven, he goes down to the earth, and it says, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. The Satan or the dragon comes down with great wrath, and he's trying to gobble up the woman who's clothed with the sun and the moon and the 12 stars, which is an obvious reference to Israel when you factor that in with Joseph's dream back in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verses 9 and 10, where Joseph had a description of the nation of Israel that fit that exact imagery. But it shows you what Satan is doing in the second half of the tribulation period. He's trying to destroy Israel. And why is he trying to destroy Israel? Because he understands Bible prophecy. He understands that God has obligated himself to bless the world through Israel. Genesis 12 and verse 3 clearly teaches that. And the thing about Israel is she's the gift that keeps on giving. God has already blessed the world through Israel by giving us the scriptures through Israel, the Messiah through Israel. And there's a third blessing on the horizon, which is the kingdom, the 1,000-year kingdom, which will be headquartered in Israel. Isaiah 2, verses 2 and 3, and many other passages indicate that. And Satan hates the kingdom because it's in the kingdom that he's bound for 1,000 years. And at the conclusion of the kingdom, he's thrown into the lake of fire. And so Satan, in his darkened mind, actually believes he can stop that prophecy from materializing. So he wages a preemptive spiritual war against the nation of Israel. And once you understand that, all these motivations for anti-Semitism, you have an explanation for them. And you have an explanation, a spiritual explanation, demonic explanation for why the world hates Israel today, and why Israel has gone through so many struggles, throughout her national existence.
Yeah, I find it interesting that it affects the UN, this hatred for Israel. Our current State Department here in the U.S. seems to be turning to the point of, where Genesis chapter 12, I'll bless those who bless thee, I'll curse those who curse thee, where America seems to be in this place of turning to curse Israel. And with the threats against Israel right now with the Netanyahu government that he better not get in the way of the two-state plan. That's one of the things that has come out just in the last few days. So we watch that taking place. But then there's this article I find really, really interesting, Andy. This says a weekend Netanyahu government already at odds with the Biden administration. That is not a surprise. U.S. diplomats scrambling to reassure Middle East allies on Jerusalem holy sites, imploring Israel not to cozy up to Russia and heading toward an impasse on the Palestinian issue. We have that. We have the Ben Gvir incident when he walked on the Temple Mount last week, and Jordan accused him of storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is ridiculous. He didn't even go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But this article is about the finance minister, Smotrich, who just yesterday signed the order to implement one of the measures the cabinet decided on last week to retaliate against the Palestinian Authority for seeking to bring Israel before the International Criminal Court in Hague. And what this move does, Andy, this move will transfer 139 million shekels from funds that were meant for the Palestinian Authority, and it transfers those shekels instead to Jewish Israeli victims of Palestinian terrorism. Yeah, you look at that and you talk about throwing gasoline onto a fire. I would agree. I mean, why are they giving this money to the PA? And they in turn give money to terrorist families, the families of the terrorists, the ones who committed the crime. It's a blessing. It's a reward system. And he's saying, we're not going to do that anymore. We're giving the money to the Israeli victims whose family members have died or been maimed through the terror attacks. I think he's doing the right thing. but the pretty much the entire Western world hates this kind of stuff. When I say the Western world, the governments of the Western world, Europe, United States under the current leadership, the UN. So I just think this is all going to escalate exponentially with what is happening there.
Yeah, I mean, everything you mentioned there in the news fits in with a pattern that Zechariah saw 500 years before Jesus was even born. 2,500 years ago in Zechariah 12 and verse 3, and then you see it further a couple of chapters later in Zechariah 14 verse 2, that the nation of Israel in the last days would be a burdensome stone, and all who would seek to lift it would actually injure themselves. And so it's a fascinating prophecy about the whole world being perplexed and coming together, trying to figure out what to do with Israel. And it's fascinating to look at a map. I mean, Israel, what is it, about the size of New Jersey? Israel's just a little drop in the bucket against a sea of Islamic theocracies that are continually threatening to drive her into the Mediterranean Sea. And it's just fascinating how this little tiny nation is the subject of so much global discussion. And yet that is exactly what Zechariah said would happen in the last days. And then you mentioned how these things are going to accelerate, and that's exactly what the Bible predicts. It's like, as you indicated, pouring, kerosene on the fire, because the nations are going to be bitten with global anti-Semitism in the last days. And it will actually climax or culminate in a global invasion against the city of Jerusalem, in the events of the tribulation period. So when we read about all these things in the news, as Bible readers, we're saddened by it, but we're not surprised, because this is what the Holy Spirit revealed to Zechariah 2,500 years ago.
Indeed, things are right on track. We don't know the exact timing of everything, but the Bible does give us these things. And even as you quoted earlier, the words of Jesus, where he says, "See, I've told you these things beforehand." So we would know, and the people that are living during the tribulation will be able to look at the Bible and make sense, which is another reason to get these messages out there, because there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be hearing these messages after the rapture. At least I'm assuming they are, as many people will come to faith in Christ after the rapture, which is evidence also that the Antichrist won't have the control on this utopian world that these people are trying to build, that some think he's going to have. There will be Andy, I look at, there's an attempt on globalism. These globalists will never realize their full effect of a global kingdom. Do you think they will?
Well, Daniel 7, I think it's verse 23, it talks about the fourth beast that I understand as the revived, empire starting from Rome, but covering the whole world. And it basically talks about how it's going to crush down the whole earth, trample down the whole earth, and subdue the earth. So in that sense, they'll have their success. But you're right. There's this rebellious contingency that is comprised of people that won't submit. So you have the 144,000 Jewish evangelists, Revelation 7, that are apparently going to have a worldwide impact. So there's some folks right there that seem to slip through the cracks of Antichrist's empire. So he'll get it, but it won't be the success of total dominion that he's looking for.
Also in the book of Revelation, we have where there's people that are saved out of every tribe, nation, tongue, and people. Speaking of the Gentile world, there's people out there that teach that those who hear the gospel now and reject Christ, after the rapture, they will not be able to be saved, because in 2 Thessalonians, the Bible says, those who have rejected the truth, God will send a strong delusion upon them that they will believe the lie. So they'll say, well, those people fall into that category. The rapture takes place. They rejected Christ. They had the opportunity. They will not be saved during the tribulation period. However, Andy, I think those people will still have the opportunity, and many of them will come to Christ during the tribulation period. Do you think, which one of those do you think is correct? Curious.
Yeah, that's a view that a lot of people teach, and they get it from Second Thessalonians 2. And basically what they say is if you hear the gospel and reject the gospel, and then subsequently the rapture happens, and consequently you miss the rapture, then you're going to go into the tribulation period and you're going to have no opportunity to believe. And I understand why people teach that. It's a powerful motivation, I guess, to kind of stimulate evangelistic results. But this came up in class. I had Dr. Pentecost at Dallas Seminary for Paul's letters. And I remember we were going through Second Thessalonians 2 at that time, and he brought up that view. You know, it's a view that has been out there for a while. And he basically said people that preach that are forcing the passage to answer a question that it's not dealing with. In other words, that particular passage is dealing with people in the tribulation period. It's not at all talking about what happens to people who hear the gospel and reject it before the tribulation period begins. So their whole view is really forcing into that text something that really isn't there. And as much as I appreciate people trying to be, to let people know there's going to be eternal ramifications for rejecting the gospel, I think the Bible is scary enough without us forcing it to say something it's not really saying. And so when people use that passage to preach that idea, just read the passage yourself and you'll see it's not dealing with, church age believers before the rapture. And so I think it's entirely possible that people in the church age who reject the gospel, miss the rapture, and then are plummeted into the tribulation period, I just don't see how God would say, oh, you can never believe. The Bible doesn't say that. In fact, through the 144,000 evangelists, you quoted the verses earlier, the second half of Revelation 7, there's going to be a worldwide revival. And don't get me wrong, let's tell people to believe now so that they can miss the tribulation entirely. I'm a path of least resistance type myself. But we shouldn't, tell people things that the Bible doesn't say. I mean, nowhere does it say, oh, well, you're not going to be able to believe in the tribulation period. So that's my kind of short answer, believe it or not, for that issue. By the way, Tommy Ice on the Preacher website, www.pre-trib.org, has a great article dealing with this subject. And I agree with Ice's conclusions there.
I love that. Thank you. I totally agree with it. It's my thinking. We need to get the gospel out. I mean, if I actually believed that, Andy, that people that we shared the gospel with now, they couldn't be saved after the rapture, I wouldn't share the gospel with anybody. Because I would be afraid of my family members that don't know the Lord. I'd be afraid of everything. I'd say, no, I wouldn't even want them to be near a church or anything because I'd be afraid if they said, no, there's no hope for them. But
that's a great point.
Yeah. So I'm curious on this one. Your take on the 144,000. You said 144,000 evangelists. I know what my thinking is. I also believe the same. But the Bible doesn't say that they're going to be sharing the gospel. So why is the assumption made that that's what the 144,000 will be doing?
Well, you're right. It doesn't say 144,000 evangelists. I mean, that's verbiage that I'm just sort of adding to simplify. But to me, there's a cause and effect issue going on here. Revelation 7, 1 through 8 is the 144,000. And then you start there with verse 9, and it mentions all of these conversions globally. And so obviously the events earlier in the chapter cause the events later in the chapter. And that would fit everything with our understanding of Israel, because God has promised to bless the world through Israel, Genesis 12, verse 3. And then you could also factor in Isaiah 42, verse 6, and Isaiah 49, verse 6, where it indicates twice that Israel's purpose is to be a light to the Gentiles. And then you factor in the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom, which you see in Matthew chapter 24. I think it's around verse 13, verse 14, right in there. And you just kind of put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, and this idea that God is going to use these 144,000, to spread the gospel. In this case, it'll be the gospel of the kingdom, because they'll be preaching the eminency of the kingdom in addition to individual salvation. The fact that God would allow that fits exactly with what the chapter is talking about, and it fits exactly with how God has used Israel in the past and how he has purposed to bless the world through Israel. So I don't have to see the word evangelist to make the call. It's just a matter of putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. And I think the idea that you have 144,000 Jewish evangelists evangelizing the Gentiles in the tribulation period, that's a completely reasonable thing to believe based on all the scriptures I just cited.
Yeah, those are great scriptures. I love that, putting all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. And then I also think, why does God save us, or what's expected of even us now when we are saved? Well, to preach the gospel. We're to worship God and share Christ. That's what we're supposed to do. And in Revelation chapter 14, it's obvious that it is these 144,000 that were pleasing to the Lord. Well, if they weren't sharing the gospel, if they're just sitting at home, doing nothing, I can't see where that would be too pleasing to the Lord. That's my guess,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it certainly seems to all fit. Those are fantastic scriptures that you shared. I have a bunch of questions that are coming in about the rapture I want to get to in a few minutes, but let me ask you this before we get there, is the Abraham Accords and Saudi Arabia, when Trump leaves office, obviously the Abraham Accords didn't go away. Israel is moving forward. So are some of Israel's neighbors. The tension is growing, it seems, between Saudi Arabia and some of the narrative that's been coming from the Palestinian Authority for decades now. Your thoughts on I know it's big. Your thoughts on the Abraham Accords. I have trouble with the Abraham Accords myself. I've got maybe my own reasons, but your thoughts on where you see this going in Saudi Arabia's involvement.
Well, I think to understand the Abraham Accords, people need to take off their political hat and put on their prophecy hat, because if you're going to come at this and say the Abraham Accords come from Trump and I love Trump, you're not going to really see what's going on here. You got to just get rid of the politics and look at it specifically from a prophetic angle to understand the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords are not peace agreements, they're normalization agreements. And they're basically an agreement where nations that formerly were not at war with Israel, but wouldn't recognize Israel, are saying to Israel, we are going to recognize your national existence in exchange for you opening up to us what I call the 4 T's, trade, tourism, technology, and travel. And if that is true, then now you have an explanation for Ezekiel 38, verse 13, of different nations that will protest the invasion of Ezekiel 38 once it happens. One of those nations is Tarshish, or the merchants of Tarshish, and they're protesting the invasion. And that makes perfect sense because Tarshish is Spain, and one of the last nations to enter into the Abraham Accords is Morocco, which has a trading relationship with Spain. So, of course, the merchants of Tarshish would protest the invasion because they're benefiting from the Abraham Accords. And then if Saudi Arabia falls, and all the analysts say they're the next nation to fall under the jurisdiction and the auspices of the Abraham Accords, now you have the explanation for Sheba and Dedan, which we believe is Saudi Arabia, why they would protest this invasion. Because via the Abraham Accords, they're benefiting from Israel. So it's fascinating in terms of what the Abraham Accords have contributed to prophetic understanding. Now, for the first time, we have an explanation, which we didn't have before, really, as to why the merchants of Tarshish and Sheba and Dedan will kind of stage a lame protest when Russia, Iran, and Turkey invade Israel in the last days, as Ezekiel 38 predicts. And so the Abraham Accords, to me, are amazing from a prophetic angle. Forget the politics. Just look at it from a prophecy angle. You have an explanation as to why the tiny specifics of Ezekiel 38, verse 13, this protest, and the specific protesters will transpire.
That is really fascinating. I never even looked at it from that angle yet, regarding connecting that with Ezekiel 38. As we see things developing with Israel, the Abraham Accords, and the excitement from people in Israel, most people in Israel, from the people in Israel I've talked to, and other people that have also told me the same thing, there is a lot of excitement with Israelis about them because they look at it like a few different things. One is there's a lot of money to be made by everybody.
Yeah.
By everybody, not just Israel, but everybody enters into this. But also, hey, we're finally going to be able to get along with our neighbors, and that is a huge factor. If you start looking at the Jewish people, I mean, when have they ever gotten along with their neighbors? Well, almost never, except for when Solomon was king. It was pretty much it just. I mean, did it ever really happen? So here's this like a light that's before him, like, hey, this might actually finally work in the history of the Jewish people. Just amazing to watch that take place.
Yeah, and the Ezekiel 38 invasion occurs, I think it says it in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, and then again in verse 11, while Israel is dwelling in peace. I mean, that's why she lets her guard down. Now, just ask yourself a question: do the Abraham Accords contribute, to this attitude of peace on behalf of the Israelis? And the answer is yes. So the Abraham Accords, to my mind, and regardless of whether they come from Trump or not Trump, that's where people get distracted. They start to interject their personal politics. And I have my political leanings just like anybody else, but just dump the politics, take the political stuff out. Don't have a rooting interest in it, in other words, and just look at it objectively. And you'll see very clearly that the Abraham Accords, I think God has allowed to come into existence so that the absolute tiny specifics of his word, and I'm talking about verse 13 and also verse 8 and verse 11, can be fulfilled.
It's so fascinating. Just watch all of these different little details come together that you could just blow over in more of a general sense, but when you start talking about it the way you are, it even makes it more interesting.
Yes.
It's just amazing to watch what God is doing. Okay, this question is from Elizabeth. You ready for a few questions?
Sure, yeah.
From Elizabeth, she says, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, she says, disciples will not be able to reach all the Jewish people before the second coming. She put it in a statement, but I'm thinking she's asking, how is that going to happen? She said Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. Let's see. When they persecute you in the city, flee to another, for surely I say to you, you will not have gone through many cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And so looking at Matthew chapter 23, I would have, so what context do you put that verse in?
Well, that's a very tricky chapter because there are some end times overtures there. But the major context, I mean, if you go back to verses 1 through 4, it's talking about the disciples that were the 12 that were in existence at the time of Christ in the first century. And then you drop down to verses 5 through 7, and they're preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And it specifically says there, go only, Jesus instructing them, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So most of Matthew chapter 10 is dealing with the offer of the kingdom that was given to Israel, in the first century. And so when people just grab verse 23 and try to say, well, we're going to make a comment about, not all the Jewish people are going to be reached in the tribulation period, even though there are some end times overtures here in Matthew 10, I just think they're not respecting the initial context. I think when Jesus said that, he was talking primarily about events in the first century.
Yeah, that's the way I've taken that passage before also, and it is tricky. I remember the last time I taught through the Gospel of Matthew, I got there, so this is rather interesting. This is from Sandy McDermott, says, do you believe the rapture will happen on a Jewish feast day?
Well, the rapture can happen at any time, a Jewish feast day or a non-Jewish feast day. I do have some difficulty with the view that people are circulating today where they say it has to happen on a feast day. They usually pick Rosh Hashanah because that's associated with trumpets and the rapture involves a trumpet. But you see, that's part of the law. The law was given only to the nation of Israel. We are a new man called the church. The church age is not under the Mosaic law. We're under an entirely, different system. And so the interesting thing about the Mosaic law is, I think it's James chapter 2, says if you stumble, over some of it, you're guilty of all of it. And the law is set up where you can't just put your middle finger, or your little finger, I should say, your little finger under the law without putting your whole body under the law. So if you're going to say the rapture for the church has to happen on a feast day, then all of a sudden, we are under the entire Mosaic law, which the Bible says we are not as members of the church. And another problem with this putting the rapture on a feast day is it destroys the doctrine of imminency, because the rapture can happen at any time. And if you're telling me the rapture has to happen on Rosh Hashanah, then I guess it can't happen, the rest of the year. And that's not the way the New Testament portrays the rapture. It could happen at any moment in the next split second. It's the next prophetic event that's to happen on the divine prophetic timetable. And I think putting the church, saying the rapture has to happen on a feast day, destroys imminency, and it puts the church under the Mosaic law. Now, if it happens to happen on a feast day, well, that's wonderful, but it doesn't have to happen on a feast day. Hopefully I made some sense there.
It totally made sense. In fact, I wholeheartedly agree. And, I have a lot of friends and colleagues that are convinced it's going to happen on a Jewish feast day. It's funny about you mentioning that. One of them is convinced Rosh Hashanah. That's when it's going to happen. So does that mean once you're past Rosh Hashanah and the fall feast, you past the Feast of Tabernacles, well, you don't have to worry about, you don't even think about the rapture. I mean, the concept is there until you come around to next fall again. I mean, literally that is what happens because, well, we can wait another year now. And it totally takes away the doctrine of imminency, and we need to be ready at any moment. Well, we don't know. The other thing I look about the Jewish feast days, I think of them, they're Jewish feast days. When you look at the spring feast days, yes, you have Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, all fulfilled in Jesus. And it was to the Jews. Granted, we benefit from that, but when I look at the fall feast days, I'm thinking they're Jewish feast days. And, I think of the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, the Lord will be tabernacling with us literally during the millennial kingdom. And I tend to lean more toward, towards the second coming of Christ for things being fulfilled, not the rapture of the church.
Yeah, if you're looking for something to happen on Rosh Hashanah, it's going to be the second advent, not the rapture. The rapture precedes the 7-year tribulation period. The second advent concludes the 2nd-year tribulation period. I think what's going to happen on Rosh Hashanah is Matthew 24, verses 30 and 31, where Jesus will gather his elect, Israel, at the end of the tribulation period. And that isn't the rapture, because that is what's described there in Matthew 24, 30 and 31. You'll also see a reference to it in Isaiah 27, verse 13. Both passages associated with trumpet or trumpets it's not a vertical gathering, but it's a horizontal gathering. The rapture is a vertical gathering where we're caught up. This is a horizontal gathering where Jesus gathers his nation, his elect nation, the nation of Israel, and protects them from the beast or the Antichrist who's trying to destroy them in the second half of the tribulation period. I mean, there's your Rosh Hashanah event. The rapture is totally different from that and could take place at any time. It could happen on a feast day, but it could also transpire independent of a feast day.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This question comes from, let's see, Brad Myers. This is yours. This is totally yours, Andy.
Oh, okay.
Well, you've talked about this before. Question: how do you explain away the fact that the 1599 Geneva Bible says, in quotes, "till there be a departure from the faith and that Antichrist will be revealed"? So I'm thinking that's a reference to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. What are your thoughts on the departure from the faith, the departure from being caught, or the rapture? Because this,
it's a discussion, it's a debate, and not all pre-tribulationists, would agree on this. But I'm of the persuasion that 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3, when it says the departure or the apostasia comes first, I understand that as the physical departure of the church, which I think fits the context beautifully, because Paul has mentioned the rapture in verse 1. He seems to be referencing the rapture down in the same chapter, verses 6 and 7, with the removal of the restrainer. And I do have a little pamphlet on this, as you know. It's not a full-blown scholarly treatise on it, but it's just a small thing people can read in one sitting if they're on the fence on this. And I have 10 points as to why I think 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3 is referring to the rapture, the apostasia, the rapture. And one of them is the English translations. The very first English translation that translated apostasia as something doctrinal or spiritual is the Reims Bible, and then, which is a Roman Catholic edition. And then the New King James Version, or the King James Version, I should say, translated it as doctrinal or spiritual because they were responding to the Reims Bible. So the Reims Bible was trying to make it refer to the Protestants, and the King James translation was trying to make it refer to the Catholics. They're the doctrinal defectors. And so these guys got into polemics, and they got away from the work of translation. And when you start looking at English translations prior to the Reims, they don't translate it as something doctrinal. They translate it as referring to departure, i.e. a physical departure. Now, did they all understand it in that sense? I don't know. I don't know what was in their minds. But when they got to the business of translating the word apostasia prior to the Reims Bible, they translated it as with a word that would fit very nicely with my view. And it's also the view of Arnold Fruchtenbaum and the late Chuck Smith and others, J. Vernon McGee. I first heard this from J. Dwight Pentecost. This is not for some reason I've been tagged with, this is Andy Wood's interpretation, and he's causing all this trouble all over the place by giving us this interpretation. Are you kidding me? I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. The first guy I heard this from was J. Dwight Pentecost, that it's the physical departure of the church. So I'm just passing the baton on. That's all I'm doing. But one of the arguments is, look at the English translations prior to the Reims. They all translated it with a word that's harmonious with the physical departure view. And so that's, I think the question, relates to that subject.
That was a great answer. And by the way, you're not saying there's going to be necessarily a departure from the faith. You're just saying you can't use that text as evidence of that. Because there's other passages, Jesus himself said, will I find faith? You find in 2 Timothy chapter 3, the people have a form of godliness, deny the power thereof. 1 Timothy chapter 4, there'll be doctrines of demons and hypocrisy. So clearly there is a defection from the faith, but I mean, and you can find many more passages too to support that. So you're not saying that's not going to happen.
Yeah, there's a real strange phenomenon that goes on in our circles. When I started to, teach on this topic, I got a lot of pushback from our own pre-trib people, and they were worried that, oh no, you just took away the verse I'm going to use at my conference next month featuring the apostasy of the church. And somehow they got in their heads that this view closes the door on the doctrinal defection of the church. Believe me, Tom, there's nobody that believes in the doctrinal defection of the church more than myself. I clearly see that as anticipated and predicted in Bible prophecy, but not in that passage. Yeah. Paul is not dealing with it in that passage. This is one of Paul's earliest letters. And I think this would be 2 Thessalonians, his third letter. And when you put the 2 Thessalonian books together, keep in mind he wrote both from Corinth, almost back to back, you'll see the dominant subject on Paul's mind. It's the second coming, not the doctrinal departure of the church in the last days. In fact, every chapter in 1 Thessalonians ends with a reference to the return of Jesus. And that continues into 2 Thessalonians 1 and 2. There in verse 1, he's talking about the rapture of the church. As I mentioned earlier, verses 6 and 7, he's talking about the rapture of the church. So I'm completely justified in taking apostasia as related to what Paul's talking about. Now, Paul will get around to the predictions about the doctrinal departure of the church in the last days late in his ministry. He starts to deal with it in 1 Timothy, Titus, and then he really gets into it very strongly in 2 Timothy. But 2 Timothy wasn't written until AD 67. Peter gets into the subject in 2 Peter, and that's not written until AD 64. When we're talking about the Thessalonian books, we're talking about AD 51. And Paul in AD 51 is not warning about the doctrinal departure of the church. That's not even mentioned in the 2 Thessalonian letters. What he's talking about is the second coming. And so for whatever reason, kind of taking Paul's 13 letters and putting them in the right chronological order and trying to figure out what Paul was doing early in his ministry, middle of his ministry, end of his ministry, for whatever reason, that gets bypassed in the whole conversation. And people are so worried that, oh no, Andy, I guess, is against the prophecies about the doctrinal departure of the church in the last days. Complete propaganda nonsense. I totally believe in the doctrinal departure of the church, just not that passage, if that helps.
I look at that and I find it interesting in the whole prophecy circle, the prophecy teaching circle. When you say something that people have held on to for so long as being fact, they heard it from a teacher 30 years ago or whatever it was, and they've held on to it. It's been repeated and repeated and repeated. You say something different, people just, they treat you like you're a heretic. There's one in particular I had. It was, I don't think it was at a conference you were at, so I don't want to mention the conference because we both spoken at the same one together in the past. But it was I said something, and I presented the whole case. I brought facts and everything, and I said, this is just a wrong interpretation. One of the guest speakers there was livid with me. I didn't know he had a whole book on it in the foyer, and it didn't go over very well. So speaking of, okay, here's a question. If you got about one more minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, last week I had my friend Bill Salas. He's a good friend of mine. He was on, and he's really believes in Psalm 83. He's written some books about it and so forth. A person here asked the question, do you believe it's prophetic? I told Bill, I said, Bill, I said, I totally get what you're saying. And he knows that I'm not necessarily sold on his belief. I believe it's going to be fulfilled. If it's a literal fulfillment, it'll be fulfilled in the millennial kingdom when Israel has all of their land. But there are different theories on Psalm 83. And is there an actual battle that's coming up like before Ezekiel 38? Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, related to what you were saying earlier about the animosity, before I answer Psalm 83, let me just say I like Bill Salas. I've got a ton of, probably you can see them behind me somewhere. If your eyes are good, I've got a ton of Bill Salas books. Bill Salas is pre-trib, he's pre-mill, he's a dispensationalist, he's wrestling with the text. And just because I disagree with him on this one point, doesn't mean I'm out to, poison his grandchildren or whatever, So, people need to just calm down and understand that we're all going to and fro, and knowledge is increasing. And so we're all trying to wrestle with this stuff. And if you have a slightly different take as somebody else on something, it's not anything, ugly or personal. I actually think that's what the half hour of silence is in heaven. In Revelation 8, I say this facetiously, of course, but that's when we readjust our charts, because none of us have it perfectly.
Amen.
But having said all that, Psalm 83, as I look at it, is not even a prophecy. Bill Salas is talking about a Psalm 83 war. I don't even see a war in Psalm 83. What I see is Asaph doing not a prophecy there, even though he is a seer, and he does, probably he could prophesy elsewhere, but he's doing what's called an imprecatory prayer, where he's basically very angry at God's enemies, and he's praying down judgment on God's enemies. And he's saying, God, sock it to him one day, do justice to him. And in this particular case, it's tricky because he goes into detail naming the specific enemies. But all of those enemies in Psalm 83 were alive and active in Asaph's day. So there's no need to take Psalm 83 and turn it into some sort of prophecy about an independent war. I think what Bill Salas is doing is he's not respecting the genre or the literary type, of that particular section of Scripture. He's treating something as a prophecy that's not intended to be a prophecy. Now, if you want the prophecy of the end times for the Middle East, it's Ezekiel 38:39. It keeps saying, in that day, it talks about, weapons being, corpses being buried and weapons being burned. There's like a real war there, but there's nothing like that going on in Psalm 83, which is just an imprecatory prayer.
Great. Thank you very much. And just a great reminder for all of us. It's like, we're all of us who are believing in Christ, we're moving forward. And even in the pre-tribulation rapture camp, we're going to have disagreements in various places, which I enjoy. I like being challenged in my thinking. I like to think through things I've never thought of before. Somebody thinks of it a different way. But ultimately, we are moving forward. And I love how you said, I am convinced I'm going to be there readjusting my charts somewhere. It's that day will come there. But in the meantime, we're continuing to grow in our knowledge and understanding like we should be. Andy, thank you very much. So everybody can see your name on here. And I know in the YouTube description, we also have how to get a hold of you. But real quick, people want to access you, your information, your material you have. How can they do that?
Well, I would love for people to sign up for our YouTube channel. Just type in Andy Woods into the YouTube search engine and it should show up. Because, we, like you, are worried about censorship, we have uploaded our stuff onto our own website and app. Our website, the stuff on YouTube, we're starting to upload more and more onto the website and app simultaneously. But the website is andywoodsministries.org. And then just type in Andy Woods Ministries into the search engine there at the App Store, and you should be able to find our app, and you can download that. So that sort of protects us from censorship, at least what we believe. And then we have a Rumble account. You can subscribe to that. Just type in Andy Woods Ministries into your Rumble search engine. And then I'm a pastor of a church, Sugarland Bible Church, and all of the teachings we do at that particular church are uploaded all the time onto the website. You know, we live stream from our website 3 times a week. Also, the Sugarland Bible Church Facebook page, but they can find the Sugarland Bible Church website at www.slbc.org. And so my stuff's out there if people want to follow me. I'm easy to find. I'm not hiding anywhere. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come on shows like this, you know, just to let people know where they can find my stuff if they want it.
It's always wonderful having you on. Real quick, the name of the book, if you have a copy, I have a copy of it here, but it's not here right where I'm sitting right now, on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It's just a small little booklet. It's not a huge book. You can easily read through it, everybody. You'll be blessed by it. Do you have a copy of it close by you?
Let's see. Looking around here, I do not have a copy of it, but it's. I mean, I have one, but
that's okay.
I'd have to.
I get it. What's the name of it? One more time.
Let's see. My diligent wife is right here. Maybe she's going to track it down. But it's called The Falling Away. The subtitle is The Physical or Spiritual Departure. Oh, here she goes. I have such a wonderful helpmate, Tom, like you have and your wife, but she brought this to me, if you can see that.
Oh, perfect. Falling Away.
It's called The Falling Away, and the subtitle of it is Spiritual Departure or Physical Departure, a second look at 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 3. And it's not written as a scholarly tome. It's just written for people that maybe they're not up to speed on the controversy and why we at our ministry take a certain position on the controversy. People can read this in one sitting and kind of look back and say, oh, okay, that's what it's about. Yeah. So it's not written for eggheads. It's written for normal people. Okay.
That's great. You guys will be blessed by it. Thank you very much. Please tell Ann I said hi, and thank you for giving you away for about an hour to be with me. We really appreciate it. Talk to you soon, Andy. God bless you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll be live here again tomorrow, 2 o'clock. I have a special guest. He's a trader on Wall Street. This is going to be rather interesting tomorrow as he brings his Bible perspective. We have exciting times. Okay, God bless you, everybody. See you soon.